Well, welcome everybody to Global Hotspots. We so appreciate all of you being here today. Alumni, friends, Plato members, students, everybody who has come to listen to what has turned out to be an incredibly timely topic. We knew it was going to be good, fascinating, interesting. Professor David McDonald is always a favorite speaker. But given the activity going on in Ukraine and the implications of the politics there, I'm sure this is going to be a very engaging talk today, even more so. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor David McDonald, who is a great friend of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, having done numerous programs and events like this one for us over the years, including Founders Days around the country, hosting international trips, and you may have seen the brochure for the upcoming Russia trip that he will be hosting again. So if you like what you hear, you could hear him for 10 days in Russia coming up. In addition, David was our very first winner of our Syriacs Faculty Outreach Award, which honors faculty who go above and beyond in offering their skills and talents to connect alumni and friends with the university. So he has a long and very positive history with us. Besides being a good friend of ours, he actually does a lot of good scholarly work, too, in his real job as a professor of Russian history with expertise in Imperial Russia and current politics of Russia. He was on the athletics board and most recently did yeoman's work in securing us a fantastic new chancellor as chair of the Chancellor Search Committee. So he's telling me he is on sabbatical this year, so we're even more lucky that you're taking time to be with us today. Luckily, the hockey game got over, or I think he probably would still be watching it. He tells me the other team won, but anyway, it is great to have him here, and he is going to spend the rest of his sabbatical working on, he was telling me, a 20-book series on Russia and the Russian Revolution and the war, so it sounds fascinating. So he's a busy guy, and we are ever so grateful that he is here, and very grateful to our Alumni Association members whose membership supports this, as well as members of Plato, Participatory Learning and Teaching Organization, and finally, thanks to our friends in International Studies. With that, no more delays. Let us welcome Professor David McDonald.
Can you hear me? Good. I tend to be a bit of a peripatetic speaker, so this would have been a bit captivating in a bad way. First, let me thank the Wisconsin Alumni Association for the invitation. Of course, thank all of you for coming out. As Sarah suggested, I've had a long relationship with the association. I've been at various institutions throughout my career as a son of a professor up in Saskatchewan. Did my degrees at the University of Toronto, did grad school at Columbia, came here in 1988, and it was in many ways like moving back home, mind you, with nicer weather even now. But something that's always struck me on the trips I've gone on with the WA or the Founders Days is the profound dedication that our alums feel to this institution. And I'll tell you, having last year worked on this chancellor search and had a chance to talk to aspiring chancellors from other institutions, it was great for my colleagues and me, and actually pretty daunting for them to see how important our alums are in sustaining and maintaining our unique, and I promise you it's a unique reputation and a good reputation as an institution. So thank you, Paula, thank you, Sarah. Nice to see Sherry Hicks out there today. As I suggested, I'm Canadian, and as we know, Canadians are nothing if not apologetic, so I have to open with an apology, which is, sorry we beat you twice in hockey the last 2 days. Some of you might have seen the women's final yesterday. The men just played an excellent and very tight game that ended up 1-0 for Canada. So I know you'll cheer for us against Sweden unless your ancestors dictate otherwise. All right. So global hotspots. It's been a while since Russia was a global hotspot. I'm just gobsmacked to see so many people out here today because usually talks about Russia, even contemporary Russia, will draw a hardy band slightly larger than the army Napoleon took with him out of Russia in 1812, but a pretty dedicated small crew and not a large group like this. And it's really, it's an interesting phenomenon what the Sochi Olympics have done for reminding us of all sorts of things about our former adversary, our former Cold War adversary. And it tells us that watching the last 2 weeks, and I was asked beforehand to come up with some talking points, which 2 or 3 weeks ago, which when you're dealing A with the Olympics, B with Russia, C with the Caucasus, and D with post-Soviet space is a fool's errand, right? Because whatever you say, events will prove you wrong. And so I made them as anodyne as possible. But what I do want to do today is talk about the Olympics and use them to suggest things about how we look at Russia and also how we might understand Putin, Putin's Russia as we become accustomed to calling it, and the Sochi Olympics as a lens on Putin's Russia in a different way than I think we're often told we should or than we think we do. Now, I do a lot of work in the history of sport as well, and one thing that always strikes me when I'm watching the Olympics, but especially this year, is, and dealing with intercollegiate athletics and the like, we are wonderfully able to practice what people call cognitive dissonance. We can believe very firmly several things all at the same time. In the Olympics, when most of us were growing up or getting to know these events, we know A, that they were all about amateurism. Although we also knew B, that they weren't really about amateurism, right? We knew, like Pierre de Coubertin told us and the founders of the Olympics, it was not supposed to be about nationhood or nationalism. It was supposed to be competition for its own sake, in the purest spirit of the Olympic movement, right? And we still hear allusions to the Olympic movement. And yet I was sitting in my office a half hour ago with my heart rate at about 145, watching these flitting images in red and white and red, white, and blue on a screen, televising action from 8,000 miles away on the slopes of the Caucasus. And I'll feel proud when I hear "O Canada," just like you will when you hear the Star-Spangled Banner. So obviously it is about nationhood. And as a matter of fact, one of the things this Olympics reminds us of is how strongly in the modern world sport and national identity are intertwined. We'll be reminded again of this summer when the World Cup goes down to Brazil, right? And we'll see people who otherwise, it always strikes me, you can see people who would cheer, say, Red Sox fans versus Yankees fans, or Rangers and Bruins fans who hate each other just as much, will all cheer for Team USA, right? It's a wonderful solvent on regional loyalties, but it also reminds us, for all that we talk about globalization and the world becoming one and harmonious and united in a system, we still really identify with these nations, with our home societies. But the other thing that we see in practically every Olympics is we're told, and we've heard this from the Russian host this week, politics have no place in sport, right? Politics is one thing and sport is another. How many of you saw the Miracle on Ice, the game? Oh, good. Wisconsin players played a big role in that. Politics had nothing to do with that, right? So we can also balance these things. Of course politics have a place in sport, although on another level we're obliged to sustain this fiction that it doesn't. Interesting case in point from this week. I won't be able to talk a lot about Maidan and what's been going on in Kyiv, in Ukraine, in the course of my remarks, but I'm really happy and really welcome questions about that after I've done speaking. But the International Olympic Committee forbade members of the Ukrainian team, national team, from wearing a black armband to commemorate the 100+ of their compatriots who were killed on Maidan Square, on Independence Square, right? Why? Because we don't allow politics at the Olympics. So when we're looking at the Olympics, we're always confronting these paradoxes. And when we look back on the history of the Olympics, we find that politics has long been part and parcel of them. Those of you who've seen films of the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, right? What do we know about Jesse Owens is that he put it in Hitler's face with theories of racial superiority by winning 4 gold medals, right? This is the same Olympics, by the way, that the president of the U.S. Olympic Committee, Avery Brundage, who later became the president of the IOC, purportedly shunted a young Jewish sprinter from New York named Marty Glickman off any competitive teams because he feared offending his Nazi hosts, right? We know politics played a role in Helsinki in 1952 when we saw the first Soviet Olympic team enter the movement and compete in the Olympics. 1968, Tommy Carlos and the two American sprinters who made a statement about African American rights on the medal podium in Mexico City. 1972, the murder of the Israeli athletes in the Olympic Village in Munich by Palestinian terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on your point of view. 1976, in my native Canada, Montreal, the first of 3 consecutive Olympic boycotts. This by countries from Africa and Asia to protest the participation by New Zealand in the Olympics because New Zealand still had sporting relations with the Republic of South Africa, the home of apartheid, as we know. 1980, the boycott, right, by the United States as a consequence of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 1984, the tit-for-tat boycott by the Soviet bloc in retaliation for the boycott in 1980. If memory serves, those are the Olympics at which the Soviet Union and the United States respectively won their highest medal counts. And you know, I was thinking about this, and we don't usually seem to associate the same type of political attention to the Winter Olympics, right? Partly it's because to somebody I heard on the internet saying to in an interview with WSUM the other day, I read on the internet somebody said, well, the Winter Olympics is really a contest between rich white people from the world over to see who can do these expensive sports better than the other, right? It's very different of a much smaller event, much more concentrated, much more esoteric. Nobody south of maybe nobody south of Janesville, unless they're in an NHL city, really cares about the hockey. Every 4 years, though, we get treated to lots of jokes about curling or about freestyle skiing or the like, but we don't think of them as political. And then, but even there, right? We have 1980, as I said, and I would argue, and I'm not a specialist in the United States, but if you're looking for the turnaround that helps inaugurate the Reagan era, even before President Reagan is elected. Remember, this came at the depths of consternation and perplexity and depression over the oil prices, the hostage crisis. The United States appeared to have been on the run since, if not since Nixon's resignation, at least since the final evacuation of South Vietnam, as it was then. And here, in the midst of this night, was this totally improbable upset that seemed to embody all the best attributes that we identify with American people. I think that had a really strong political impact. More recently, the 2010 Vancouver Games, again, I will apologize, the Canadian team went into it with the oath that they were going to, quote, own the podium. And they coined a phrase, we are winter, right? We Canadians. Something that I know you'd like to dispute today. I can think of Norwegians and Swedes and Finns and Greenlanders and Icelanders and Russians who would probably also suggest that they might have something to do with winter. But these have been minor keys. Sochi has been something different. It seems to have been political right from the outset. I was going back through newspaper clippings and archives online, and already in 2007, when Sochi received the bid, there was all sorts of consternation and head scratching. Sochi had originally polled second among three bid finalists, one being Salzburg in Austria, one being Pyeongchang in Korea, and then Sochi. Pyeongchang had won the first ballot, but not with enough votes to carry the day. And Salzburg was dropped, and all of a sudden, in the second ballot, bang, Sochi wins, right? a little seaside town. What was it known for? It was known for being the favorite beachside hangout for the likes of Stalin and the Politburo in the Stalin years and after. It also happened to be a favorite seaside hangout for Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who at that point was nearing the end of his second term, right? Was supposed to be his final term, but who's going to quibble over legalities, especially with a Russian? But Putin himself had gone. The vote was held in that great winter sports destination of Guatemala, and Putin had gone down and expressly promised that despite the utter lack of infrastructure beyond the facilities to support the political elites, the cottages or seaside homes, he would single-handedly promise to build a total infrastructure for the city, capable of supporting the worldwide crowds that usually show up at Winter Olympics. But B, he also guaranteed the presence of sufficient snow, right? Now, one thing that we know from those of us from what Churchill called the English-speaking peoples, when we hear people make promises about the weather, we're involuntarily reminded of King Canute, right? The Danish king in pre-Norman England, who said he didn't say it. His courtiers said he could stop the sea if he wanted to, and to prove them wrong, he shows that you can't. But he guaranteed snow. There are rumors, and probably not unsubstantiated, that people receive certain pecuniary inducements in order to change their vote and see the wisdom of an Olympics in Sochi. And those of you who followed World Cup bids over the years or know what happened with the bidding that led to the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City in 2002, this is not a totally improbable suspicion, right? But so right from the outset, we see this stalked by politics. And it becomes a way of talking and thinking about Russia, especially as we get closer to 2014, a Russia that seems to have done a U-turn, right? For the first 8 years, Putin, for his first 2 terms, Putin had struck us, at least for the first part of it, as a great relief from Yeltsin, right? Yeltsin, who we thought was a shambolic drunk, who had presided over, and he was as little popular among Russians as he was among Westerners. Russians were embarrassed by him. He had the unfortunate necessity of presiding over the total collapse of the Russian economy, not once but twice, right? In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the sort of sporadic privatization that had gone on in the 1990s, and then a massive recession that hit in 1997, almost on a scale of our 2008, but an economy that was much less able to sustain it. So collapse of the Soviet Union that way, but also the collapse of an imperial structure in which, often unwittingly, Russians had taken great pride in, right? That despite earlier promises to respect Russia's interests in East Central Europe, the former Warsaw Bloc, by the time Putin comes to power on the eve of 2000, with Yeltsin's, at Yeltsin's request, the Baltic republics, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, not quite yet, but had all become members of NATO, right? The one political complex whose raison d'etre was directed against the Soviet Union. At the same time, NATO felt free to intervene, whatever you think about it, I'm trying to give you the Russian perspective, in a disintegrating Yugoslavia, right? Raining bombs on Belgrade, taking sanctions, negotiating a new status quo with Bosnia. These were all areas that Russians, whether they were democratic liberals or hardline conservatives, all felt were their business as Russians. This had long been a Russian area of interest. So Yeltsin had presided over the seemingly pulverization of any stature that the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation had ever enjoyed. What's more, he was clownish. He was frequently in one or another state of inebriety or possible incompetence and the like. Putin seemed to represent a turnaround. He seemed much more single-mindedly dedicated towards economic development, to improving the lot of everyday Russians, to advancing education, at least it seemed to us by contrast. Within Russia, he seemed what Russians would call a serious man, серьезный человек, somebody who respected himself, who seemed to take an intelligent view of matters, who was analytical, who seemed cultured, which was quite remarkable given his background, and who foreign leaders respected. Right? We know the high water mark of American and Russian relations came in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when Putin was one of the first foreign leaders to get a hold of President Bush and express his sympathies and offer his support. Now, by 2008, things seemed very different. He seemed to have, as Cordell Hull once said of Molotov, steel teeth. He seemed much more inclined to authoritarianism. People were a bit perplexed when he obeyed the Constitution and stepped down as president after his 2 terms. But what did he do? He made one of his proteges from St. Petersburg president, Dmitry Medvedev, and he himself became prime minister. And the Constitution was altered to make it a parliamentary republic rather than a presidential republic, right? So in the run-up to Sochi, there was increasing politicization of this process that was partly couched or focused on our changing perceptions of Putin himself. And part of what we've confronted with Sochi, because by the time the games were coming to be ready, one thing that intrigued me was, I suppose I could put it generally, is how persistent the shadow of the Soviet Union has been in the way we look at what's going on. Like, let's remember, the Soviet Union disintegrated officially 21 years ago last Christmas, 21 years ago, December 25th, 2013. And yet, I've heard announcers, I've heard jokes, I've read wisecracking on the internet that would suggest, I've even lapsed into every once in a while I'll talk about the Soviet this or that. It's amazing the hold that perception, our ways of talking about the Soviet Union, still have on how we look at Russia. I want to bring our attention to this because part of our understanding of Sochi and the Olympics that we have to be aware of is the way we look at and interpret it. We already slot it into certain convenient, what scholars would call tropes, because these are ones we know and they seem to correspond to the reality. So what did we find? And things actually that indicate how different things are, and I'll get to that in a second. But already by the fall, we started hearing about cost overruns, wild cost overruns, in the construction of the facilities for Sochi. The original estimates had come in, a $13 billion budget. That's a gulp. But we started hearing reports of 52 billion, right, to build it. But according to the best Soviet traditions, not only were they running way over budget, they were doing a lousy job, right? Once people started to be able to do site inspections, and I'm sure if you prowl the internet, you would have seen them, the toilet fail. That's the new way you talk about hash mark fail. But toilet fail, hotel rooms weren't ready. God forbid reporters were forced to share rooms with each other. Stray dogs were rounded up and either euthanized or sent somewhere. Whole neighborhoods were deported. It all felt very Soviet. So this combination of overweening grandiosity and total pathetic inefficiency, right? Worse, a year ago right about now, a law passed making propagandizing same-sex love to minors a crime, right? Anti-gay propaganda, it was called. And we started seeing an increasingly persistent drumbeat of seemingly sanctioned street violence against gays, an attempt at resistance by LGBT activists, increasing dismay among the sporting community abroad. Although one thing I did learn was that if you ever want a cause to succeed, sorry Alejandro, I told you this joke yesterday, if you ever want to succeed, have your thing succeed in the United States, your policy, what you do is show that the Russians hate it, and you'll do just fine. And so, so the amount of support that we've seen and encouraging support for the LGBT population in this country as a consequence of the Russians' conduct is quite striking, right? But we saw that. We saw the mass demonstrations on Bolotnaya, the huge square in downtown Moscow, hundreds of thousands of people showing up in protest of the fixed elections of December 2012. And things started looking eerily familiar, right? Eerily familiar to the Soviet Union we'd known and hated. And what this has done, I think, is when we look at Sochi, and let me note parenthetically, Sochi's actually worked out a lot better than we had any cause to believe from the pre-coverage. What we were worried about, it was sitting in the Caucasus, right by Chechnya, these Chechens whom they had mercilessly pummeled in the 1990s and the early 2000s, again, perceptual issue. And I just throw it out there, and I welcome anybody to contest it. But one of the things Putin said to Bush in 2001 was, you know, what you've been dealing with about Al-Qaeda, we've been dealing with that since the Soviet Union broke up, that the same money that fuels Al-Qaeda has been paying for Muslim terrorists and jihadis in the Caucasus. Maybe we shouldn't be there, but we've been there since 1799, and we consider this our country, and people want to stay in it, now whether or not we believe that. And we were making a deal about Chechnya and about being so close to these terrorists in 2011, 2012, 2014, while we were engaged in military actions in Afghanistan, or still are, in Iraq until a year and a half ago. Again, our perceptions and our ability to be cognitively dissonant is quite striking, just from an analytical point of view. Okay, I'm not siding with one side or the other in this issue. Just to give you, as we transition over the Russian side, what it looks like, what it might look like to them. So we see all of these things gathering, and what happens? They actually pull off the opening ceremony. It's quite striking, and in a funny way, it's not unlike the last 3 or 4 opening ceremonies we've seen for Summer Olympics, right? It's a chance to introduce yourself as a country to the world. You play on about your history, right? Think of the great, who was it, Neil Jordan's great opening ceremonies at London in 2010, or I can think of 2012, I can think of Vancouver in 2010, the spectacular Beijing opening ceremonies, right? Which are all self-advertisements of different countries, whether the Brits play up their Dickensian sort of roots, or the Canadians made fun of their cultural stereotypes, you know, the moose and the Mountie, and that the Chinese celebrated their great history. The Russians celebrated their history. And yet, what did we read about? That oh, they should have mentioned the Gulag. They should have mentioned collectivization. They should have mentioned X, Y, Z, right? And Russians wrote back on Twitter, said, well, when you had Los Angeles or when you had Salt Lake City, we didn't see anything about the native peoples in the prairies. We didn't see anything about slavery. We didn't see anything. It sort of went on. It's every country presents the image of itself they want others to see, and the Russians were no different. What strikes me, though, in all this is there was an Olympics recently where whole neighborhoods were deported, animals were euthanized. We suspect there were large cost overruns and lots of pockets lined, and they didn't seem to occasion any sort of reaction. And these were in 2008 in Beijing, right? A government that is every bit, I'd say even more high-handed than the Russian Federation. We hear far fewer voices of dissent from Beijing and from China, outside of the poor, odd, self-immolating Lamist monk, or the odd academic in Beijing, or artists like Ai Weiwei, but nothing like the torrent of you know, Alexei Navalny, the people in Bolotnaya Square, Pussy Riot, who actually put in a cameo in Sochi this week to very good effect. Again, just another example of, with the Chinese, we sort of let it go partly to, I would suspect, I've got two reasons for thinking this. I think that with the Chinese, with China, we got to know China how? Largely through missionaries. Those of you who read Pearl Buck growing up, or you know, Henry Luce, or Luce, the founder of Time magazine, the son of missionaries. We got to know them through missionaries at sort of the nadir of their existence when they were, and they would tell you they were a colony. We got to know the Russians through our friends in Great Britain, who had seen them as enemy number one, except for about 8 years, since 1815. And we sort of inherited all that perception in 1946, I would say, when Churchill is at Westminster College and talks about the Iron Curtain, and he talks about Russia in ways that I would have recognized from the Duke of Wellington after the Napoleonic Wars. So I think we tend to look at them in a certain key. And doing so has obscured a lot of complexity that is what I think I and a lot of my colleagues find really interesting and perplexing about the contemporary Russia. Because you see this fascinating admixture of old and new. To be sure, you see an authoritarian state, no question. And I'll come back to that because that is what Russians know. An authoritarian state, but is it a Soviet state? Well, how do we know about these cost overruns? We know about it through Twitters and tweets and blogs and public statements that, that all sorts of people who disagree with the current government have made public. And some of Putin's most harshest critics are former high-ranking political figures. There's a former Minister of Finance from his first term. There's a former Prime Minister, actually a native of Sochi, named Boris Nemtsov, who is very public in his criticism. There's a whole new cadre, a whole new group of young professionals from Moscow and Petersburg particularly, who have criticized Putin publicly. But so that is new. I started going to what was then the Soviet Union in 1975. I studied there as part of an American group. We stayed there for about 6 months. You would never have heard anything like this level of dissent in those days, and I think we tend to lose sight of that. So that dissent was new. What else was new and old? Who built these facilities? Who are the guys? Where were the cost overruns coming from? Well, instead of really ill-run state ministries, right? Ministry of Civil Construction, Light Industry, all the rest of it, that routinely squirreled away all sorts of money that was funny money too. You couldn't exchange it. Its value it seemed to be arbitrary in that. If you needed more money, you printed it up and you let the black market soak up some of the waste to give people consumer goods they wanted. We had an equally centralized and directed plan for development, but the people that did it were all private contractors. Now, private contractors who were happen to be childhood friends of the president, but you got to go with people you trust, right, to do a good job. And this is where the corruption lay, was in the overweening power, from the point of view of Russian critics, of the private sector, right? Similarly, we see a recrudescence, not yet complete, of the old big red machine, right? The Soviet teams were so great because for any Soviet world-class athlete, you began preparing for your career as that about the age of 6 or 8 years old, depending on the sport. That the state had all these special academies. It's funny, it's a model that the Chinese have preserved. The Australians and other people have replicated, although in a different way. But you would be identified and enrolled in school, and that's what you did most of the day, was practice your sport. We also know that by the 50s and 60s, the Soviets had begun developing what we now call sports medicine. a very applied and very closely attentive examination of the physiodynamics of optimizing athletic performance, which is what also gave us doping. Right? They were the first scientists that start playing around with enhancing performance drugs. To great effect if we look at the record of the East German track and field teams or swimming teams from the 1970s and 1980s. So it was all state-run. Now, these teams and these programs have been revived, but what happened was Putin said to a series of tycoons in Russia, oh, Alexander Ivanich, you got volleyball. Oh, you've got hockey. You've got figure skating. Any oligarch was given the charge of a team and given the responsibility for developing it. So there we see an interesting hybrid as well. And this gives us one thing that is new, and where the Soviet Union has changed into something different, is the one lesson that Putin's generation or Gorbachev's generation, even Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, God bless him, was that money is a very powerful emolument of power, right? That you really need money to achieve your goals. And ironically, he's honoring, when this realization honors a tradition that also gave us Adam Smith. Back in the late 17th century, how many of you read Robinson Crusoe or, Robinson Crusoe or Moll Flanders or like Daniel Defoe? Defoe was stationed up in Edinburgh in the late 1690s. My ancestors, factions always were yelling at each other about whether or not you wanted to join with those Sassenach Englishmen, right? And Defoe was watching it, and to him it was obvious that if Scotland became part of what would become the United Kingdom, more money would flow in, but more money would also flow to the United Kingdom. And he said, for international power, he who has the longest purse wins, right? War isn't as much about getting soldiers in the field as it is having the money to pay for them, right? And what the late Soviet generation and Putin figured out was, you've got to have money, you've got to have real money in order to make your way felt in the world. What we used to call hard power is not sufficient in and of itself. And so what they have found is you let the oligarchs make money, but you dictate the terms to them under which they get to keep that money, because they also have a very different understanding of law than we have. And to us it looks pathological. I explain it very simply, and I see people who've audited courses with me. Russia is one of the few European societies that grew, that was whose territory was never part of the Roman Empire. And old post-Roman areas, whether it's Britain, Scandinavia is a different story, but Britain, during France, Italy, there they inherited through the church Roman notions of law, including right? Including that there is a set hedge to the power the state or the sovereign authority can impose on you. And you can defend that through appeal to law, and everybody respects the law. Law in Russia is what I think legal theorists euphemize as positive law. Law is what the state says it is. And if you try and appeal above the state, well, there ain't anybody above the state, as Mikhail Khodorkovsky found out, right, in 2004. He was recently released, the person who established Gazprom, sent abroad. So we see that the state still exists as a redoubtable instance in Russia, but its occupants have recognized that somehow you have to tap into the market as a source of power and as a source of enhancing your power. Something the Chinese have understood as well, by the way. One of the other things, the tradition we come from will tell us that the more you allow the market to circulate, and our histories tend to prove this, the more market relations, and this is Adam Smith's argument, the more you understand the benefit of market relations, the more civilized you become because you start learning how to defer gratification. You start learning about things like saving and investing and widening your time horizon from the here and now. That's how we can have mortgages and things like that. But you also understand that you need trustworthy and firm laws to establish the boundaries, the rules of the game, as it were, right? And so we have, since Smith's time, always believed that commercial activity would have a civilizing influence. Now, this makes great sense in Northwestern and Northern Europe and North America and that. If we look at Russia and China, they understood the power part of capitalism, but they've found the law thing a bit inconvenient. And it seems, I think one of the things that when we're looking at Russia, or when we're looking at China, one thing that we have got to stop fooling ourselves on is that somehow, if we develop a middle class, and that somehow they'll become more like us. They'll become more like us in that they'll be prosperous. And I think even the Sochi Games, we have seen some real marvels. We've seen a huge infrastructure built where there was nothing, and that will persist. Well, maybe they've never been very good at maintenance, but we've seen. How many of you have been to Moscow or Petersburg the last 10 years? Because these are dynamic, thriving cities. The people, there's a certain mean that people have on the street that very inexpressive in that. But I'll tell you, I go there, having first gone there in '75, and then about 20 times between then and now. I'm blown away by how much more prosperous they become, how much more fashionable people are. When I first went to the Soviet Union, I could tell you what country people were from if they were foreigners, what part of the Soviet Union people were from if they were Russians. I'd never seen such pervasive poverty in my life. That the people had enough to eat if they had the patience to stand in line to get it. It was a country, and also let's think about this when we're thinking about law, where in order to keep body and soul together, you routinely had to break the law. And the state looked the other way at that because they needed you to break the law in order to preserve their agenda. So that is new. But I think the final couple of minutes, what I want to talk about is what Sochi, and plug into what I was saying earlier about the amount of dissent we see. To me, what Sochi has shown is Putin, who has appeared to us this quasi-autocratic dictatorial figure. I've always been suspicious of explanations like that. And again, here's another great example of cognitive dissonance that the Cold War and that gave us, and also gave Russians and Chinese, is we think that somebody at the apex of power can wield unquestionable authority, right? Stalin was a dictator. Putin, or Brezhnev. Remember the Korean airline that got shot down in 1983, and we had this vision of Brezhnev twitching, and he had very impressive eyebrows, twitching an eyebrow, and immediately a fighter squadron scrambled in Yakutia and shot down this unhappy passenger plane, right? We thought of it on one hand as this glistening, sleek juggernaut machine that President Putin seems to be reassembling. And on the other hand, we would tell ourselves communism is inefficient. Large organizations are by nature corruptive and inefficient and hidebound by bureaucracy. So notice how we can maintain the two things. There's something we should be thinking about in trying to resolve that paradox when we look at Putin. Is my hunch is, and I think we can see it in Sochi, is on the one hand, Putin, as it said in the blurb, is crafting messages to all sorts of audiences. And some of the messages overlap. For instance, getting Sochi was a huge coup for him, right? But it was also a challenge. It's the last time, but it's worth thinking about. The last time the Olympics had been in Russia, it was the Soviet Union, 1980 in Moscow. We know now about Brezhnev and that regime that they spent the country into the ground well before the 1980s to maintain a nuclear arsenal that would give them parity with the United States. there was this tremendous desire. I would put it differently if I were writing a scholarly article, but for our purposes, there is this tremendous desire among Russian elites to be recognized, right? That to be recognized as equal with, in this case, the United States. It's an urge that we can trace all the way back to the reign of Peter the Great, when Russians first learned that they were what we would call backward. Before that, they thought they were the center of the earth. They thought we were all barbarians, right? So this tremendous desire for parity and to show off the achievements, as Brezhnev would have said, of fully realized socialism. What happened instead? It became a humiliation. We left them standing at the altar, right? Especially the United States. They didn't care about Canada not going, or a couple other delegations. The British came, but they're yesterday's power. That they wanted the United States. That was a tremendous humiliation. And you heard street jokes in Russia after that, that a lot of rank and file Russians, that became a moment when they realized more clearly than even before that the structure was necrotic, that Brezhnev himself, he embodied the sort of decay and rot in the system. So Putin, so one message he's sending with Sochi is to his people, look how much better we are now. Look what I've done for you. Look at all the glitz. Look at these nice hotels. Look at all these foreigners. Look, we used all Russian designers to make, the competition bibs and all the accoutrements. And the decor's been quite nice from what I can tell, the competitors. Look how hip our kids are. The opening ceremony we saw, interestingly we saw a band, a female duo, whose whole shtick is to play lesbian, right? This in a country with anti-gay laws and the rest of it. And so he was showing we really are modern, we really have arrived. Russians, we're back. We can be proud of ourselves. One thing that Putin has been much more active about than his predecessors in the Soviet era or in my era is trying to encourage a Russian nationalism, or Russian patriotism. That we're proud, we're great. We lost it for about 15 years because the Soviets were inefficient and Yeltsin was a stumble bum. Yeltsin, to whom he owed his power, by the way. But I have brought you back. And as part of that, he appeals to traditional values. One of his biggest supporters has been the Orthodox Church. I'd love to give another lecture on that as hotspot. The biggest winner in the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of assets, in terms of political leverage, in terms of legitimacy, the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Russian Orthodox Church was a huge supporter of the anti-gay propaganda law and a huge supporter of a strict stance against the protesters on the Independence Square in Kiev. Putin also is different from his predecessors, and Sochi helps remind us of that, in that he's got several reflexes, but he actively wants popular support. Like one of the great ironies in post-Soviet Russia, Putin is the one guy that doesn't have to recur to trickery to get elected. Once he gets outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, he gets north of 65% support in any poll I've ever read. Moscow and Peter he's lost, but it's like Margaret Thatcher used to say about the chattering classes, let him say what they want, nobody listens to him anyway. And Putin understands that. And he's giving these folks, he's playing to them saying, look how great we've become, look what we're able to do. Now, the fly in that ointment is, given how avidly these people consume sports and how much we tie sports to national prestige. Need I remind you again, Canada won both games the last week. But the one thing, and it's sort of Bush League hubris, but the one thing he's said all throughout the Olympics is there's only one gold medal that counts. And this Olympics will be a failure. Anybody know what? The men's hockey team, yeah? Right, they're going to eventually, they didn't make the medal rounds. And in many ways, they've become a symbol of the resurgence of post-Soviet Russia because they were a shambles through the 90s, right? The big red machine that used to so amazed the New York Times writers and the like. Again, as a Canadian hockey fan, I took a different view of them. But they were supposed to reclaim their rightful place as, and sort of symbolically of Russia, as a world power in hockey. They get beat by Finland in the knockout round, right? That was not a good turn. It's not what Putin was expecting. But he's able to show his countrymen that it's a great power. And that's a conversation, including the anti-gay law and including sort of the national discourse, that he sees himself conducting with them almost in private. Because, it's the last big concept I'll give you, the one thing that's really old and continuous in this whole situation, it's implicit in what I was telling you about the law and about the relationship that Putin has established with the oligarchs in that, is, and it's rooted in this sense of backwardness, is that when I say Russians learned they were backward under Peter the Great, up until then they had used straight religious ideology to think, well, we're Orthodox, we're the only true believers. Those Protestants, those Catholics, whatever they aren't really Christians. We are the last rump of the righteous on earth. And then Peter got his behind handed to him by a 17-year-old kid named Charles XII at a battle in 1700. And he had all these advisors who were foreigners, and they'd had foreign experts there since about 1620. And they said, and they'd for years been telling them, because he'd sort of been in political exile, this place is a dump. It's crummy. The midden heaps of Edinburgh, the suburbs of Amsterdam, are light years beyond this place. He started seeing history as a path of development, as a path of progress, increasing civilization, increasing prosperity, increasing military might. And so the whole thing has been to catch up. But he also came from a tradition in which the monarch enjoyed unquestionable power, right? No Roman law. Right? You guys talk about George III as a tyrant compared to Catherine the Great, even compared to Frederick the Great. He was a piker. He was, he might as well have been a machine liberal because he obeyed the law. He said he had absolute power, but he could be overturned by Parliament, could be overturned in court. Not a Russian Tsar. And what evolved was this idea, and it became one of the cornerstone legitimators for autocracy, for the empire, but also for the Soviet Communist Party, and now for the Putin state, is only the state, which is seen as a self-contained institution, is able to defend society, bring it order, and order it in such a way that it can advance to progress to be a leading nation. Because underneath all these national myths, whether it's British, Russian, Chinese, Iranian, there's a sense that we're the top, right? And that's how we'll get there. And so Putin profoundly believes that you have a state that's situated above society, acts on society, educates society as to why it is obliged to support it, and at the same time, that state participates in an international realm of other states with whom you conduct a totally discrete set of relations, right? That has nothing to do with domestic politics. And so to the other country, when you get the anti-gay laws or things like that, and they hear protests from abroad, they say, well, it's not about you. This is our conversation. Now, let's talk about trade, or let's talk about this or that, or let's talk about spheres of interest. Let's talk about geopolitics. And that is how the really big surprise in this Olympics has been the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, the independent square in Kiev, and this pre-revolutionary meltdown that's going on in Ukraine. But it's interesting that that's starting to unfold. Apparently, they signed a truce agreement today, in the middle of the night. That has been, that just unfolded in the closing moments of Sochi. But one thing I want you to think of when you're watching the closing ceremonies on Sunday is Putin is not only just positioned between a domestic sphere that he's trying to control and an external sphere he's trying to negotiate. He gets his power from a dizzying array of groups. Commercial and industrial power, a military to whom he's been very kind, a scientific intelligentsia, researchers in that he's tried to persuade to stay in Russia because they're hemorrhaging really smart people all over the place, go to the math department here, applied chemistry, any of the food businesses, you'll be amazed how much Russian you hear. They're trying to refurbish their intellectual infrastructure as well. So he's balancing that. He's balancing between a vision to make what he call a civilized Russia and what he would call the realization that people aren't ready for that yet. They're not ready for real democracy. They have to be educated into it. Again, another very venerable concept in Russia. So the Putin that looks to us like a dictator is actually a mediator who seems to be acceptable for all sorts of reasons to the various groups he's trying to balance. And one might argue that all the inefficiency and corruption and that we associate with Sochi is probably more a reflection of the limits on his power than it is an expression of his power and its corruptness, although I wouldn't exclude that latter. So, ironically, something that was meant to be a showcase of what he's done for Russia, one might suggest is a showcase of what he's done to Russia, for better and worse, but what it's also what he's been unable to do. And we should be thinking of that when we deal with him in the future. Thank you for your patience. I went on a bit longer than I thought, but I welcome any questions or comments, and again, about Ukraine as well.
Thank you, Professor McDonald. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit more on the opening ceremonies. And there are a couple of things that were really striking to me there. One is that World War II was also not a topic that the Russians really wanted to breach. They spent more time in the ceremony itself on Tolstoy than on anything to do with World War II. But in the alphabet presentation preceding that, they managed to mention, say, Nabokov, who had very little positive to say about the Soviet Union. And for the letter Zh, they chose to put Zhukovsky, the 19th century Romantic poet. And that is an obvious opportunity, it seems, to say Zhukov instead. And so I'm wondering, like, what sort of line do you think they're trying to balance themselves on, or in that presentation of culture, science, technology, and not other achievements?
Well, I think you put your finger on it in the last part of your question, Zach, is that they were showing that, and Zach's a graduate student in Russian literature, so you know the word kulturny, right? And they were trying to show we have a rich cultural heritage. I think the guy that put that together is a very interesting movie director who has one foot in sort of the dissident camp and 1 foot in the government camp. He's managed to play both ends, get to the middle better than anybody since a guy named Nikita Mikhalkov in the late Soviet era. But I think there the point was, you're not going to belabor the same things you've always belabored and people know. You're going to remind people that there's this very rich Russian culture. That's why they used the little girl, right? And it was her dream and imagining it and that, and sort of taking people, and also, but taking people, also reminding people that Nabokov and all these emigrate, like the guy who did the sets and the lighting lives in Brooklyn. Brooklyn, and well, no, I won't indulge in Manhattan chauvinism, but that I think they were trying to show Russia that they don't think people knew or know, and try and remind a lot, especially Western-based artists, how much they owe in terms of how they think of images and literature and that, to a tradition that they've often subsumed under this idea of tyrannous despotism. Sir, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think that the Russian influence on the Ukraine is tragic in a way. I mean, that's to me, to use Putin's phrase, a geopolitical tragedy is that Russia cannot provide a example for cooperation that the Ukrainians can accept. And yet I can see many geographic reasons should be and could be and ought to be in a unified sphere. And certainly Putin was ready to come across with a lot more concrete help than the EU.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I know how palatable this everyday Ukrainians feel about corruption. That's terrible. But on the other hand, there is something that Russia does have to bring. And
Oh no, the Ukraine is, well, the problem with, this is a really, and historians make a lot of money telling you this, but it's true. This is an incredibly complex situation. Because it's hard to think what every Ukrainian thinks. It's hard to know what every Ukrainian thinks. Yanukovych, even Viktor Yanukovych, the current president, who was elected after his predecessor was installed by the Orange Revolution, had sort of not lived up to his promises. It rapidly degenerated into infighting with Yulia Tymoshenko, right, who's an oligarch who's sitting in jail right now thanks to President Yanukovych. But Yanukovych enjoyed a lot of electoral support. And that's one. Two, a lot of Ukrainians are very ambivalent. Some want to be more closely tied to Russia. Some want to be tied with the EU for political, cultural reasons as much as for economic reasons. Certainly there's a sense that they all share. We know this as of December 1991. There was a referendum there on whether they should stay a part of the Soviet Union or go their own way. And language preference, whether you spoke Ukrainian or Russian, was not a really strong predictor. Something like 90% of the citizens of the Ukrainian Republic voted to be an independent state. So that's part of it. I'm not sure who you talk to, right? I'm not sure. I know what, I recognize the Russian government's impulses. And this is a really interesting one because one of the problems when you plug into world markets as a source of power and possibility is you also develop a dependence on them, right? Now I'm going to be interested to see, now they've signed this truce that's going to have early elections, elections before the end of 2014. They're going to redraft the Constitution, so they say, to make it a parliamentary republic, as according to the Constitution of 2004. They're going to incorporate representatives of the opposition party, so that's Vladislav Klitschko and a guy named Chekhnebok, and I'm trying to think of the other guy, but sort of three opposition parties, incorporate members of their party into any new cabinet. And who knows what they're going to do with Moscow. Moscow had promised them $15 billion in more or less free credit, whereas the EU, which is sort of, the questioner was right, it really doesn't have anything substantial to offer. But the one that's going to be interesting to watch is the agreement says that if the demonstrators, the opposition, who have arms, if they turn their arms within 24 hours, there won't be any problems, right? But after that, fair game. Now, if you're one of the people that was on Maidan, are you going to turn in you're going to trust these guys, right? So that's part of it. The second part, though, is Russia's got to be careful because it gets a lot of money selling natural gas to the EU, to EU powers. And we're getting in a situation now where they're starting to have different people they can deal with, including, ironically, Iran, right? Or Canada, or other parts, or even the United States at a certain point. So he doesn't want to be the guy that kills the goose that lays the golden egg. So he's under restraint there. I take your point. There are points of very deep affinity, and this is, I've been following the. It's the first time I've made full use of my technology. I've got an iPad, and I've got an iPhone, and I've got a really nice TV, and I've been watching Olympics at night, and then reading the Twitter feed from Maidan, and then reading blogs in Russian, Ukrainian and Russian from Kiev, and then Russian blog responses. And wow, you're right. It's not just geopolitical feeling. It's a really deeply seated cultural feeling. Like, the idea that Ukrainians don't like them is very distressing. And this one's a sort of a gut issue. It'd be like, it isn't even like Quebec seceding. It isn't like Scotland seceding. It'd be like Colorado seceding, or Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is probably the best example. So I don't it's really hard for me to see a plurality, let alone a majority, among Ukrainians settling on one or another solution. Because the EU and Russia, that's just part of what's getting them going. What they really hate is, if you go to, apparently you go to rural Ukraine, nothing much has changed since 1991. People's standard of living have not improved as quickly as their Russian counterparts, and there's still a lot of family ties and back and forth between the two countries. Ukraine seems to be just a Republican-level Yeltsin of countries, right? They're not very serious. They don't perform very well. And yet you see all these guys, and from a Ukrainian point of view, a lot of guys with foreign names who are getting richer than Croesus. And they're doing it on Yanukovych's watch. And Yanukovych's, the rap on him was always that he was just a stooge for the moneyed interests. And so that part is complicated. And then you go on to Maidan, and it's not like the Orange Revolution. It's like you've got everything from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which doesn't want anything to do with the Russian Orthodox Church. You've got people, the usual suspects, people from Western Ukraine, from Galicia, Hadychizna, who were only in the Soviet Union for about half of its existence, and very unwillingly so, as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact, and who see themselves very different. We're never part of the Russian Empire. We're part of the Habsburg Empire under Polish rulership. But say, when Yanukovych was elected, we could all say confidently, well, he's from the Russian-oriented one, part of the republic. He's from the eastern provinces, which were settled first by Russian immigrants to farm, when the Russian Empire extended southward in the 18th century, and later by the parents of the likes of Khrushchev and Brezhnev, who found work in the coal and steel mines and mills of the Don Basin. But now, this time out, and something that didn't show up in our press, authority totally dissolved. People in Lviv, or Lemberg, or Lviv, the capital of Galicia, cops defected en masse. The governor resigned after the first attempt to storm Independence Square in Kiev. Said, I have no authority here. People took over. This happened in town after town across Western Ukraine, but it also happened in Poltava and Kharkov, which we've tended to see as strongholds of pro-Russianism in Ukraine. And it's partly generational, it's partly class political, it's all sorts of, it's much more complex, plus which you've got a hard right nationalism that is just breathtaking in its virulence. In terms of I saw a Twitter from one guy, and I saw another guy interviewed in an American paper saying, I don't, and he spoke in very, shall we say, scatologically trenchant terms. He said, I don't care about Russia. I don't care about the EU. I care about Ukraine, and I want the Jews out, and I want the Russians out, and I want the Armenians out. I want Ukraine for Ukrainians. And these guys have been appropriating arms and coming out in full armor and provoking the cops, right? So, but in Kiev itself, you've had whole detachments, whole precincts of policemen refusing orders to go down to the Maidan, to the square. And I think Yanukovych is relieved that he didn't have to declare a state of emergency. Does anybody remember the 1991 in August in Russia, in Soviet Union, when Gorbachev got kidnapped? And that the turning point was a couple of special designation forces, sort of their version of SEALs, who refused to accept orders to impose the state of martial law that this junta had proclaimed. They went over the other side. Never good, if you're in power, if you think that your chief form of coercion is going to leave you in the lurch, because then you got no power, right? That's what happens to Nicholas II in 1917. I think Yanukovych was afraid of that. I think that brought him to the table. So what's going to happen? Who knows? Ukraine has always been a very interesting problem. I think Ukraine's been a more palpable thing, and having grown up in an area that's very Ukrainian. Like I could go to a pub in a town the equivalent of Cross Plains or Spooner or that in my home province and hear Ukrainian spoken by people my age, right? having grown up very heavily Ukrainian, my sister-in-law is named Nahorna, which doesn't sound very salubrious in English. When my wife asked her if she was going to change her name when she got married, she said, "What do you think?" But it simply means somebody who lives on the hill. I think the diaspora, in funny ways, it's sort of like us Scots, the diaspora seems to have a much more concrete idea of what it is to be Ukrainian than Ukrainians themselves, because they live it in a different way. They live it in constant contrast with Norwegians, if you're in Stoughton or whatever, right? And these people have had to negotiate it for 150 years. So it's a mess. And I think it's such a mess, it's really it's hard. I'm going to be fascinated, but in a sort of a macabre way, to see what they can piece together, bring peace, because they were really close to the precipice. Not civil war, but just some sort of awful anarchy that nobody would be happy with, and would always be a cause for some sort of revision, right, and correction. So that one bears watching. And we thought we were past all the trauma of it. And I agree with what he said in a different way when Putin referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. If you look outside if you look at Bulgaria, Romania, large parts of the former Soviet space, the Middle East, things aren't necessarily better, right? They were jerks, but they were jerks who were greedy enough that you could depend on them to keep quiet in their own precinct. They weren't going to be a complication, they were just going to be a pain. And now and we got used to it being simple and a pain in the posterior, right? And now it's just, there's this continual unraveling that I think can be really dangerous. So that's a short answer to your question. Yes.
Actually, that's all the time we have for the
okay.
large group. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Please join me in thanking Professor McDonald for joining us today.